Wider still and wider shall thy bounds be set. God who made thee mighty, made thee mightier yet. God who made thee mighty, make thee mightier yet. Także tego. So, I hope you remembered that we were supposed to do it in English this time. It's English language turn. So we are doing it in English. No problem here, I hope. I am tonight as the representative of those Europeans who were yet respected back then, back in old days, by Asians, for instance. And in those days, European powers were respected in Asia, and no such things as challenging the West really happened. Not only because of the sheer power of the European countries, especially of Great Britain, but also, or United Kingdom. United Kingdom exists from 1801, really. So before it was Great Britain from 1707, as the Americans say, 1707. So European powers were respected not only because of their power, not because of their military capabilities, not because they were superior technologically, but also they were respected because European people, European elite, have imposed on themselves many moral obligations, which are not really the thing today. Because, for instance, when European people were used to wear very uncomfortable but proudly looking types of clothing, of dress, so there is also something of there was also some element of self-sacrifice in their demeanor. So Europeans were respected because they were to some extent embodying the Asian ideal of self-sacrifice. And the Europeans of today are just so loose and always seeking for what's easy and comfortable, and they are always in t-shirts and all those casual clothes. It's all loose and lumpy, and waving this way or that way. And it's also a big chunk of the problem why Europe is not really respected anymore, because it isn't. To some extent, Britain and America, of course, as the country of European origin, with its people mainly of European origin, and the same case with Australia. So the whole AUKUS system, we could say, is to some extent still respected, but it's not typical for most of European countries, even those who are economically still pretty potent. So yeah, so not only the situation has changed, but also the whole attitude of Europeans. The Europeans of yesterday were rigid, self-sacrificing. They were disciplined. They could be relied upon. They were people of their word. They were men and women of their word. And today it's not really the case. We are usually seeking for what's very easily obtained, and so on. Yes. So we don't have the Western civilization of those days anymore. We have some sort of hedonistic circus, and hedonistic circuses are rarely respected. especially by peoples who value, still value some kind of discipline and rigidity, as the Chinese, for instance. So the Chinese are also empowered not only because up to the moment of maybe signing the AUKUS treaty, but until recently it was very obvious for everybody that Asian peoples are not respecting us because we lack this element of rigidity, we lack this element of discipline, and that was precisely what was respected back in old days by Asians in regard to European powers and European people. Okay, so my uh, my um, my small tirade I have planned for tonight, it's over. So I'm waiting for your questions. So yeah, share your thoughts with me. By the way, most of the uniforms which were worn by colonial officials, for instance, were even more rigid than this one. This one is pretty casual, but the high collars, very, very, um, always standing, always uncomfortable. But it was not being comfortable was not everything, and I worry about the West because Western people are usually behaving a little bit like that. Oh, I'm so starving. I was waiting for 20 minutes at the bus stop. Oh my goodness. I thought I would kill myself. It was so long before the bloody bus came. You know what I mean? That it's such a problem for Europeans today. Even the smallest things, and whereas in other cultures the poverty or some other considerations stop them from being so soft. Yeah, it's not what I'm here saying. It's not by any stretch of the imagination. It's not some apology of colonialism or something. It's just stating the simple fact that we changed, and the rest of the world is was valuing what was before in the Western culture, not what is today the Western culture. Of course, the questions you would be posing, it's not, they are not necessarily to be about Britain or about colonialism. You can to ask me anything. Just do it in English, not a problem. Still no questions. You can always use translator if it's problematic to write down something in English. But I am sticking to our regulation that every second Q&A is done in English because what I'm also trying to say is, and what I also like to communicate to you is that discipline and doing something which is not perfectly comfortable, it's valuable in itself because um, seeking always the easy and the comfortable, it's not the answer. Everything that is hard and not so easily obtained is always more valuable than something which is not. Or maybe not always. Maybe if you would like to, I don't know, build a big scale model of Eiffel Tower, for instance, using I don't know, using matches, maybe it would be not very worthwhile. But usually it is so in like 90% of cases. It's more valuable what you obtain with some effort. This is one of the reasons why I am learning Chinese right now. For instance, because the one reason is, of course, I am taking it with a little bit of humor, of course, but it's possible that because I have criticized the Chinese Communist government so many times, it is possible that if they win the world struggle against, and this is the, of course, the hybrid struggle, which involves the input of economy, not always military actions are taken. But what we observe today in the West, it's also the and we can also see that Chinese influence is growing because, for instance, we are still more and more concentrating on controlling the population. I'm not saying here about the regulations which have something to do with the plague that we have now, but just in general terms. For instance, the simple fact that we have video cameras everywhere, installed everywhere, it's a little bit scary. Of course, there is something like 800 million, of course, 800 million video cameras installed in the world, which is monitoring public places, streets, some other venues, and half of them, roughly 400 million, is installed in China alone. Although the Chinese people put all together are something like 1/5 of the whole world's population, because the world has almost 8 billion people, and the Chinese is like 1.4, right? So it's 1/5 of the global population, and in spite of that, they have the half of the cameras installed in anywhere in the world in China. So, and they are, of course, they are using it for a very precise reason. They are using it for monitoring people in order to make this whole program possible. The program is about social credit. It's called the social credit program. Of course, I don't know. I'm learning Chinese, but I don't know the original name of this project. But there is those cameras are, of course, interconnected, and they are based on the system which recognizes the face features, and they will know if you are behaving properly in accordance to all the rules imposed by the Communist Party of China, and they can, for instance, make the situation more hard for you when you want to, I don't know, take some loan in the bank, or maybe even if you want to leave the country, if you are drastically low in in all those tables, then it could be problematic in those columns. It would be problematic for you to go outside the country, for instance. So it's even that level of craziness. So And so you have some general idea why I'm so opposed to the not only the government of China, but especially the growing influence of China in the world. And the growing influence also includes, for instance, the total domination of the Chinese public and the Chinese audience over the NBA games, over many branches of sports in America, for instance, and that's why, for instance, do you remember maybe this wrestler, very famous wrestler, John Cena? John Cena. Oh, by the way, what's with the shot? Oh, hmm, it's something new. I am also unable to put some text into the chat column. Did you try? Maybe. Hmm. I don't know why. So that's why you were not asking me any questions. Maybe or. Hmm. Oh, oh, now Jesus, now, yeah, I was seeing no questions whatsoever up to this moment. I had to push some buttons, and now I can see them. Yeah, Jesus, because I was curious why you are not asking me any questions by now. It was a little bit strange based on our previous chats. Okay, so yeah, hello. And, yes, I hope it's interesting. Oscar Snyder, what do you think about young children, cute or annoying? A little bit annoying. I am not a babies person. Aren't you afraid of the IQ degradation of Western European people due to immigration? Well, it's not so easily stated if the people who are coming to our culture are inferior in this way, because to obtain, for instance, a serious job in the West, you require not just IQ, higher IQ or something like this, but you require some. mm, um, you require some set of skills which have more to do with education than with IQ itself. You could be a very successful person on the labor market, even if you are not especially smart. So I think the most problematic thing with the immigrants from other continents is not that they are a little bit inferior, or maybe even inferior intellectually on average, but that they don't possess any skill. For instance, I have heard about Afghan immigrant in Germany who was really seriously considering getting a job, and he wanted to continue his career he had back in Afghanistan, which was to as when I mentioned Afghanistan, I just switched to American like accent. It was funny. Afghanistan, yes, Afghanistan. The British were also in Afghanistan. So yeah, so he was planning to do some um, to continue his job as the small producer of carpets, and he was not he has had no chance whatsoever to succeed in this in Germany, not because it would require for him to get some I don't know papers to make it all legal or something, but because his family and his friends and his numerous cousins and so on would be 100% wanting him to make it all free, so they would get free carpets. So we are forgetting that those people are also limited not by the lack of intelligence, because they can be very intelligent, not because even the set of skills that they would require, it would be required for them to have it in Western European or in America. in Western European country or in America, but they also limited by some cultural considerations that they cannot just put aside. Yeah. So it's mostly about culture. It's not most about intelligence. How academic year is about to start? Do you not feel? How do you feel about it? And what's your opinion of about the level of Polish higher education? All in all, I don't think the Polish higher education is so bad. Of course, we have a little bit too many faculties which are about the humanities and not so many about high engineering, but it's a general problem. For now, only the Japanese have limited the number of faculties, humanistic faculties of various branches of humanities. So I think all in all, it's not that bad. I am more concerned about the high schools, for instance, and why history is taught in high schools. For instance, when it comes to history, of course, because it's always the most important for me, and that we have this very artificial and ineffective separation of lessons about the history of the world and the lessons, the whole world, and lessons and the courses the lessons which are about Poland also only. Well, as long was Britain's decision to join World War One good, on your opinion? I think that well, it's always interesting to see the different variants of what could happen, but in this case, Britain's involvement in World War One was already made when the Germans attacked Belgium, because Belgium was not just some country. We have this tendency in Poland to treat Belgium as something as well, another country, not very important, ripped apart by cultural struggle between the Flemish people and the Walloons, and that this is true. But Belgium is also a country which is very important for the general European stabilization, because it was always, well, not always, but from the early 19th century at least, it was the center of some English dominance, and which was connected with the idea that we should have some neutral zone, some neutral venue in which we could, in which the European more potent powers could meet and discuss about the puzzling things. So attacking Belgium was also attacking the idea that we would have such a place, and the idea of some. It was like attacking attacking the idea of mediation between states itself. So it was like attacking the whole point of the whole British exceptionalism, and because Belgium was uh, Britain's doing, so it was a child of the British diplomats. So um, it was obvious that if the Germans attack Belgium, it would mean that Britain joins the war. So for us, we completely ignore this Belgian element in that that it played a great role in this decision when this decision was being made. Yes, I did an IQ test once, and you know the problem with IQ tests is that they are usually For instance, the main problem with the IQ test is when you are not expecting any particular questions or tasks, because they are mostly usually about tasks. Then, if you know what the task will be, more or less, I don't mean the precise information, but the type of the test, then you will be like 30 points smarter when you make this test some other time. And I have discussed this with my mother, and my mother is psychologist, and she's saying that it's not so easy to make this IQ test really, because it would require to make a couple of them to measure different types of intelligence. So making just one test about just one type of intelligence, for instance, only some graphic lines which should be connected, and you are connecting those, and if you do good, then you are smart. It's absurd, because you can be smart in this and you can be very slow in something else, and sometimes the time is measured, sometimes the time is not so much measured. It's really not so easy to estimate a person's intelligence. And I don't need, I think, to add that most of the people who are performing those tests were organizing the possibility of for the people to fill in such tests. Those people usually don't have the required documents, or they don't just understand what they are really posing in front of the people who are tested. It's the same with for say, let's say, psychology of Sigmund Freud, and his whole idea of psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis is a set of different tests again, and those, some of them are really, because it's very often said that most of the ideas of Freud and most of his approach is already ridiculed and unfashionable, and well, estimated as not very scientific and so on, and it's not true. It all depends on which type of psychoanalysis, and it also depends on if the whole, for instance, list of questions which would be which would be used in this whole course of psychoanalysis, and the tests which has something to do with psychoanalysis, they can be modified in the 1960s, which would make them far more scientific than before. And some are modified, some are not, and it also changes the whole opinion about the level of how scientific this method is. So the same is more or less with IQ tests. Could you tell more about current diplomatic conflicts between English-speaking countries and France? Well, the most recent conflict is, as I mentioned in my Oculus film in Polish. It's because it has to do with the thing that Australia was supposed to buy some French oil-powered, gas-powered submarines, and there was two problems with this. There were two problems. First problem was that when you have to face such a threat as the growing power of the communist China, then you would better have the atomic engines in your submarines. Why it's so important? Not necessarily atomic weapons, and it was stated very distinctively many times by Scott Morrison, the Prime Minister of Australia, they are not obtaining submarines which would be armed in nuclear weapons. but they are obtaining submarines which are only propelled, driven by atomic engines, by reactors. And it's so important because when you have atomic engine, then you then, for instance, most of the engines of the submarines, which they when they are classically made, they are made in a classical fashion, then they are pretty noisy. So so the element of the quiet engine is essential here. And also, what is also essential is that when you have atomic reactor, then you have far more range, and you don't have to go to the base to refuel so often. And the Chinese fleet, although it would be still in numbers much more powerful than Australian Navy, would not feel so comfortable as before, knowing that the Australian submarine could be literally everywhere. And this is that's what's important here. And the other problem with the French treaty about the classically made and classically driven submarines was that the French engineers were pretty late on the schedule, and there was also some previous treaties made and signed by France, and not they were highly unsatisfactory when it came to really delivering the military equipment. So the combination of those two, that the Australia really needs submarines which would have the advantage over the Chinese fleet of this being everywhere and nowhere, and considering how big this operation theater how big this operation theater really is. This combination of this and the unsatisfactory behavior of the French in previous situations like this resulted in just scrapping the treaty with the French, to the great, of course, annoyance of the French. And the French, they are now saying that they have established the relation of confidence with Australia, and this confidence is now broken. They even used the word. What was the word? It was the trahi. It's. It was traitor. So traitor make the Australians are traitors or something like this, because they have established the relation of confidence, and it's a total breach of confidence. The French have used this word that nous avons établi une relation, un rapport de confiance avec les Australiens, et cette confiance est maintenant trahie. This is exactly what the French Minister of Foreign Affairs has said. So the French are recalling their ambassador from Canberra, and it was very funny. It was summed up in a funny way on the television network with Sky News Australia, of course, the right-wing television network, and they have said that French ambassador is recalled from Canberra to France, and still he is not satisfied. And who would not be happy when being recalled from Canberra, where the big city maybe, but not very interesting, and even in comparison to some other more interesting Australian cities like Sydney or Melbourne. and you are recalled to Paris, right? And he's still not satisfied. So the French have also tried, and they are now trying to make the other European Union countries to make them break all obligations towards Australia and even recall their ambassadors from Canberra, which is really crazy. It is really looking as if the French were working for the Chinese to some extent. We know about this conflict between the Anglo zone, between Australia, United Kingdom, and United States, who were trying to some extent to make the other Western countries to abstain from being more tied up with Chinese economy, but they didn't succeed mostly. And now it's clear that we have a very powerful division between the Anglophone countries, like the countries that formed just now the AUKUS, yes, and the others like French, like Germans, and so on, and Russians. Russia should be also considered a part of the West because it is really, but even from the times of Peter the Great. So we have this breach in the middle of the Western world, and the Chinese are well, they are profiting from this situation. So it's really not. You know that I am rather pro-French. I am always, and I was also asked why I was so critical about the French in relation to this development when before I was defending the French from the unjust remarks which are so common in Poland. For instance, they didn't help us in 1939, for instance, although they did. They have started on September the 7th. They have started the offensive, which they halted on the 12th because they've got the information about the plans of the Soviets to attack us from the east, and they were realizing, being the rationally thinking nation, that it's impossible to fight Hitler, Mussolini, and Stalin at the same time, even for the Polish allies. So they have, of course, retreated, and they came on the Maginot Line and prepared for the invasion of their country. But when it comes to the relations of the French with English-speaking countries, they have behaved usually in far worse manner, and they were much more. And as the journalists of the two network I mentioned before, Sky News Australia, he has said very justly, has observed that the French, when it comes to the relations with the English-speaking countries, they pretty much come and go as they please. So they can form a treaty, they can form an alliance, but then they can also break this alliance because they are not feeling themselves at home too much with the Anglosphere countries. So that could be a problem. So in this case, the French have behaved in an abominable way, and it reminds me the policy which were implemented by the chief of the European Commission, namely Ursula von der Leyen, who I was usually not very critical about because she was rather a sensitive voice, and that's a rare thing in the European Union to be a sensible voice. But she also tried to make it impossible for the British to take all the vaccines they have bought on the in continental Europe. She wanted those vaccines stopped and not moved to British Isles because she wanted them for the Europeans, although she herself has failed in procuring those vaccines for the continental Europeans, for the peoples of the European Union. The European Commission totally failed at this. So we have something very similar here. We can see a country which is important for the European Union, which cannot take the blame, which cannot admit that something was wrong, and still tries to be a bully. And it's not nice. And when we remind ourselves that Australia is, well, it's a country that has the 11th most powerful army and navy in the world, more or less, maybe 12th, maybe 13th, but very high on the scale. And then still it's less powerful than France and much less powerful than European Union combined, and still it's looking a little bit like a bullying. So yeah, in this case I am with the Australians 100%. Although in many other cases I was a little bit pro-French because I believe in atomic energy, and I am always worried and puzzled why the French are not recommending atomic energy to Poland. And I think that I know the answer, and you would not like my answer, because I think that from the Treaty of Maastricht, or really Maastricht, because it's in Dutch language and it's in the Netherlands, so it's Maastricht, not Maastricht, which would be in if it were a German town, but it's a Dutch city. From the Treaty of Maastricht on, the French have treated the Eastern Europe, for instance, as some sort of the German sphere of influence. So it's not a problem for the Germans to accept the possibility that the French engineers, atomic engineers, would go to Italy or Spain to recommend atomic energy, because it's assumed that it's a French zone on influence, the Mediterranean zone. It's more or less it's treated as if it were the French sphere of influence. But when it comes to Eastern Europe, it's all verboten. The fondue in the French language, it's not possible for the French to freely recommend their technological solutions in the Eastern Europe. So sorry, I've pontificated so much on this question, but it was a very interesting and question which also recently came up. So I allowed myself to elaborate on this a little bit more thoroughly. Okay, so I wrote that they are gonna to limit death penalty where? In China? Or maybe. It's no longer time what was worse. Of course, the Soviet Union was worse than Russian Empire. Russian Empire, which was I also made about the Russian Empire one film about Russian Empire in the past, and compared it a little bit to Soviet Union. In imperial Russia, the typical case is that you would have those parts, those circuły or gubernia, and gubernatorial zones, and in one of those zones you would be persecuted very severely for the same for some crime, and in other zone you would be persecuted, you would be punished in a very mild way, because there was theoretically penal code and civil code and so on, and the law was existing theoretically as one system. But when it came to details, when it came to how the country operated and how the all Tsar's services operated, you could have a totally different situation when it comes to crime and punishment. Putting it in more literary Russian terms, from one zone to another. So it was a mess, but still it was, well, maybe making this exception about the peasants, because the peasants were freed in the 1860s, but then they were that there were some economic entities which came after the feudal slavery system, and still the situation of the peasants were not much better, because they had to accumulate some money to buy themselves out of the service. So really the slavery, so-called slavery, because they were not, their bodies were not totally connected with the land, so it was not slavery like I don't know, the south of the United States, but it was close. Their situation was pretty gloomy still to 1880s, but still, when you consider that some of the Russian aristocrats liked the idea of accepting their manners, and they accepted very more interesting or artificially talented, artistically talented people, even if they were peasant and from peasant families, which was not typical in Western Europe. The wall between the nobility and peasants in Western Europe could be higher or deeper, as which way you would like to put it. So it was something very unusual that the Russians sometimes made it possible for the very humble peasant to make some sort of artistic career, for instance, and it resulted, I think, with this situation we have today, that Russia have this unproportionally big number of people who are artistically very, very highly talented. And so it was not that it was all bad about the peasants. So when it comes to townsmen and other people, Russia was a mess, but it was no tyranny. And when it comes to economy, Tsar's Russia at the end of the 19th century was economically developing in a very successful way, and they have exported many grains and food and things like that to the whole world, and were competing with the United States, which also has developed these unprecedented powers when it comes to agriculture, exactly in the same moment. So in the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, and so on. So and in the same time, the Tsar's regime had little control over the whole territory of Russia, because for instance, the Okhrana, the state police, had something like 30,000 officials, 30,000 officers. 30,000 agents in total. So it was too little to counteract those growing ideas about anarchy or socialism, and those political sects which were appearing everywhere. So Tsar's Russia was a mess. Rather, there was no tyranny. It was by no means a totalitarian state, although it had some tendencies. When we think about I know Ivan the Terrible and this more this more Asian Russia in style before Peter the Great. But when we compare the Russia of the 19th century with Soviet Union, it's because it's this idea of Richard Pipes that in some way Soviet Union continued these very totalitarian tendencies which existed already in South Russia, because, for instance, the church was totally subjected to the state and so subjugated to the state, and subject of state and subjugated to the state, both. And but still, when it comes to this more European version of Russia from 18th century, from 19th century, and when we compare it to the craziness that was the Soviet Union, then the Tsar's Russia is much more benign, much more sympathetic, much more positive system. Even when we remember about all this mess, about this really not very well adjusted system of the law, contradicting laws, contradicting codes, very sometimes abjectly different situation, legal situation in one gubernatorial zone and another. Okay. I have made a film about Alexis de Tocqueville and also about Benjamin Constant. I have made films about them. Just search on my channel. Something like 12 minutes each. What actions should the government take in case of blocking the KPO subsidies by EC? KPO? Aha, okay. Poland could do very well without those. That's the truth. That's the truth. The civic platform, Platforma Obywatelska, would counter the situation in which those means are frozen, and they would be available again if and when and if they come successful in the next elections. So we can do very well without those, but they could be used in the oppositional propaganda. That's the only thing. Wy napominajcie mnie uczestnika bitwy pri Isandlia. What? Isandliwanie? I don't know what battle you have in mind. And I would appreciate if you form this in English, because it's already a little bit complicated to answer in a productive way, of course, because otherwise it would have no sense whatsoever in to answer all those questions. And when I have to change the language all the time, it's also so you mean, have I read David Myśliwiec's book about Przepis na człowieka? No, I haven't. I wanted to buy it, but still it's something like 60 zlotys, and sometimes when the book is over 40 zlotys, I always think, buy or not buy, because I am buying, as you can imagine, many books, and yeah, so I'm not the same with the book by Tony Judd about the after about Europe and the world after World War II. Also hesitating if I should buy it or not. I am positively sure that the IQ has not decreased in the last 40 years in the Western world. What only decreased is the capability of, for instance, making more sense from written word. We are much more about information which are presented in the presented in form of pictures and films, which does not necessarily mean that we are more stupid or something or incapable of thinking, but it also because when we assume that the ability of, for instance, reading books decreased, then we can also assume, I think, very easily that the ability of watching, of getting information from films and things like that would be much less effective in those days when films were still a new thing. So it pretty much evens out a little bit. Even if we are complaining about the stupidity of modern people, it's, I think, because we didn't hear many voices before, and now when we have the internet and every stupid person can present their stupid ideas on the internet, then we simply see it for the first time. It does not mean that we have the age of stupidity or something like this. I think it's because we were simply ignoring the stupidity of previous epochs, because there was no such thing as the internet. So internet is working pretty fine for people who are exceptionally able to think in a good way, in a productive way. And internet also magnifies stupidity, but not in this way that the stupidity is growing, but in this way that we cannot escape this wave of stupidity. But it does not mean that this wave of stupidity were not existing before. It was existing before, of course. I have no I have no idea about the so-called maturity exam in Polish schools. I think that should be some, and I think it should be more taking into the consideration this very crucial element that already at the end of high school, pupils should be already, to some extent, they should already be considering some specific type of faculty for studying. And I think it's just pointless that you would torture everybody with mathematics, for instance, when it comes to those. And I hear that it's more frequently the case that you torture them with mathematics, for instance, which is, and it's obvious that most people don't get it, mathematics on a higher level. Does not mean that they will not be a productive members of the society, because most people will not choose professions or studies which have something to do with mathematics or more to do with mathematics. So I think that the maturity exam should be more specified and should also take more. They should be more based on what studies this person is going to take after high school. So, for instance, if the pupil's dream is to become a marine biologist, he should be just taking this exam on biology, I think, and maybe just one foreign language. They would be enough. That should be enough. I don't understand why we are torturing everybody with Polish literature and mathematics, and even had this urge to do it before. I don't know the details how it's made now, because I was not particularly interested in it. But I always thought that it's absurd that we require people to be experts on Polish literature even at this phase of their lives, when they should be already thinking about which faculty to take, which studies to take in the future. And it should be more, okay, so you would like to be a biologist, so biology plus I don't know, English language, or physics because you want to be a physicist, and German language or something like this, which would also have because it would be also nice to somehow connect the language with the field of interests. For instance, when you are considering taking the continuing your studying by studying, for instance, of law, then you must remember then the legal system in the continental Europe is totally different, or maybe not totally, but very much different from the British or American one. So English language is not really that much required. And you could do it, you could decide already being in the high school. But of course, there's some drawbacks in this approach, of course, also because I have also observed that, for instance, when I was in high school, then we had classes like humanities class, which offered English language course and French. There was also a combination with with English and Spanish, and it was previously, what is maybe could be interesting to you, that when I came to the high school, my high school, when I started there, then it was the first year in which the first year when the Russian language was substituted by Spanish. And the other combination was the biology chemistry oriented class, which also had Latin and German. And I have chosen exactly this because I wanted to be a biologist most of my younger years. So, but if you would like to be a lawyer, then, for instance, German codes would be very much of your interest, because much of our political system is based on that. But you would take German language, and in my case, it was so that you could have a German lessons, but only in connection with some other types of classes. For instance, not legal, not the subjects which could, the fields of interest that could bring you more to studying law in the future. So it was more like sets of skills and less some good starting position for the future. So maybe I could put it simply in this way. I have already bought a better microphone. You should hear me when I was using the first microphone. I was using simply the microphone and the camera, which is built in the notebook I have, and that was catastrophic. I was counting on the possibility to show you some more interesting details, for instance, some text or some more sophisticated maps and some elements of those maps, but it turned out that this camera is pretty good for the general picture, but it's not so good when it comes to showing details or scripts and so on. So yes, I am considering buying even more professionalized camera, but we see about that. I have now more pressing matters to attend to. We are planning to make 18th century ball, so I have other expenses, and it could be a little bit more money, I think, to spend than the camera I have now in my possession and which I'm using now. I never heard about the culture of critique by Kevin MacDonald. I don't know this book. Maybe it's very good, but I would strongly recommend not to be too English speaking about. It's funny that I'm saying it in English because we have planned it so, and it's but generally I can see the Americanization of books, of the sets of books people now read. For instance, I can hear this. For instance, I have a big problem, and maybe you have already encountered this. My take on the on the channel, which is entitled Polska w remoncie, with I don't now I forgot the name of this person who is running this channel. Tomasz something, I think. So Polska w remoncie, Polska w remoncie, I think, or something. I don't know. Some economist is running this channel, and he almost never recommends anything which was not written in English and that was not written in the 20th century. Whereas in economy, it's not so much new under the sun. Really need to you really need to know some Bastiat or some Smith, some things from previous eras. And when it comes to history, politics also. For instance, I am a little bit shocked and I am disapproving the fact that many people who study political science never heard, or maybe heard, but never read anything by Alexis de Tocqueville, for instance, anything of the good old stuff, but they know some fancy new American authors who are saying basically always the same, that democracy should work and it would be nice if democracy worked. Democracy is not working. We all know that. We can only say that there are some much more monstrous political system that could be implemented, so we better stick to democracy. But so I think that I am not so much keen on getting all the new books, especially American books, because they have this way of just planning to write a book and then they think what it could be about. I am suspecting this culture of writing books, of book writing, that has something to do with America. And I remember that all the good books, almost all the books I've read about political science, almost all the good ones were French or German, or and it does not mean that I am anti Anglo-Saxon or something. I am very much for the Anglozone, and I think that the Anglosphere or the Anglozone, Anglosphere is more popular. I think the Anglosphere, the AUKUS countries, and so on, they are the only one that could a little bit bash the head of the Communist Party of China. But when it comes to writing about the situation, I think the Germans, the French are much more interesting, much more insightful. maybe it's because they simply use on the daily basis two languages, for instance, English and their own mother tongue, and they are not only limited to English way of thinking and so on. So when, for instance, when you have a book about China written by an American, then you have two cultures. Most probably you would have a contact with two cultures. His own culture of America, for instance, and the culture of China. When you have the German author who would bring some of his ideas about the present situation, if he is, of course, not controlled by the very questionable politics of the European Union or something like this, but if he's independent here in this respect, then he would be very probably much more interesting to read, because he would have three ways of thinking in one book: the German way, the American way, or the Western way, big scale, and then the Chinese way. Yes, Oscar, you are referring to my ideas that 2005 and 2019 were the years in which the most important events of the 21st century happened, and I still think so. Yes, the first, it's the bridge between the Anglosphere countries and the other Western countries, about the policy that should be implemented about terrorism, about Iraq, about China, and the other is the moment 2019 was the moment when the Russians proposed a treaty of alliance with to the Chinese, and the Chinese refused. Yes, I don't think that AUKUS is as important as those events, but it's pretty important. Yes. Especially when because, for instance, the Chinese, after signing the AUKUS treaty, have already reacted in a very hostile manner. They are even in a theatrical way a little bit, because they know that if Australia is much more technologically advanced, it would be not so easy to grab all those islands on those spheres of influence and so on. They are limited already a little bit by India, to some even more extent by Japan in the nearest neighborhood, but they will be even more limited by Australia's capabilities, and they are already furious about it. So yes, maybe it would be. Maybe we could assume that the process which started in 2019, when the Russians has proposed the Treaty of Alliance to the Chinese, and now we can see the continuation of this process, when the Chinese are alone because they wanted to be alone. They are not using alliances. They are just using debtors. They are just using countries to which they are the creditors, and the countries who are economically dependent on China are those which China is using. So China is not allying with any other countries, just using other countries. So the whole philosophy is much more power based, much less friendship based. So we can see AUKUS as maybe as the inevitable, or to some extent inevitable, result of this Chinese resolve of sticking to the old way of using just creditors and not forming alliances, which has something to do with the hierarchical way of seeing the world, in which the country, the Zhongguo, is the country which is in the middle of the universe, or in the middle of the political universe at least, and all the other countries are bound to be dependent and bound to be obedient. And Russia, by its sheer size, with their sheer size and um, the whole ambitions of Russia, it's impossible to be um, a dependent country 100%, maybe only to some small extent, depending on China. So they had to be refused. So they were refused, and now maybe it's very interesting, Oscar, that you've mentioned those those events of 2019, and now the what we have now with AUKUS in conjunction, because in connection, because uh, that could be something in this, that the AUKUS could have been created because Russia is out and China is on their own to some extent, we could say. So maybe those are connected more than we even think. What will happen with ever great crisis with Chinese government react? We don't really have access to the economical data of the Chinese because they are falsifying it. They're forging those data, forging the data. So we can only assume, and maybe you can just switch on YouTube even any expertise done or any opinion done by some economists on for instance, Fox Business Fox, the branch of Fox television network of the United States, which is about with the one that is about economy. It's Fox Business, I think. So they were only guessing. The guessing is what they can do because China is totally concealing the economical data, often forging it. So we don't really know. We don't really know what is happening there, right? So I don't know what will happen with ever great crisis. I will not pretend that I'm smarter or have some top secret information, because I don't possess some information like that about this problem. When we talk about intelligence, we talk about what really? However, true, you can prep for the test when you know what to expect. Yeah, yeah, of course. That's just a remark about the IQ test. Well, as I said, the IQ tests are of many different kinds, and some are correlated with the life success, and some are not because they are totally different. All in all, so yeah, the same could be said exactly the same could be said about the psychoanalysis. Because IQ tests, they have a questionable scientific value and the same way as psychoanalysis. But we are living in the world which, what people say, is mostly based uh, on the on how much fashionable some opinions are, and it is undoubtedly fashionable to say that the IQ tests are scientific and psychoanalysis is not. Whereas, in fact, we have many variants. That's why I've made this comparison between the two problems, because we have many variants, many sorts of both, and they have limited value or some more value in depending on the sort, on the kind. Well, I have heard that sometimes you do the corroboration of the results, asking the person to fill in the same IQ test again, and then you because as I said again, as I said, sometimes we combine many subtests, and sometimes it's just one test. So I am very skeptical about the value of most of the IQ tests, because I fear that most of them are done in the improper way. Just to put it simple, to make it simple. The old Russia before Stalinist regime, before the socialist revolution, was capitalistic, and was even involved in the global market of crops. So I don't. For me, the whole thing about saying that feudalism and capitalism were just one epoch after another is false. I think it's a Marxism dogma which has very little to do with reality. I think that feudalism is mostly. I think that every economy is capitalistic. Every, even when you have socialist regime run by Stalin, then you will have a country that is behaving like one big factory, like one big company. It does not mean that it's not capitalism anymore. It just means that it's a stupid kind of capitalism. When we have a feudal relations, then you have mostly you can discuss them in legal terms, because feudalism is more a legal system than economical system. Of course, the system of autarky, which is to some extent, which to some extent the feudalism is based on, that every region for itself, and every region is producing the things that this region needs, the people of this region need. This is one thing, yes, but it does not mean that it's not capitalistic. It's still capitalism, but just on the local scale. Making Just assuming automatically that you have to have something on the national or global level to call it capitalistic or to call it free market is stupid. You always have a free market. You can only limit the natural free market. So although I am not a libertarian, something like this, I think that free market is like air we breathe. So you can only limit the free market, and sometimes you should. When you have, for instance, a very cheap crap which is sold by China without any toll, without any additional payments done by the Chinese. You should have your country's economy protected to some extent. Yes, but that does not mean that you can have or have not the free market economy. You always have the free market economy. You can ignore the fact, but it will be free market economy means that you just can deliver something and be paid, and it's not something that would require a big companies like East India Company or Microsoft or something. No, free markets, it is when one Neanderthal comes to meet another Neanderthal, and they switch and they just exchange gifts or something. It's already free market economy. So it's very funny that we still think with these stupid Marxist terms that feudalism is the economical system. Feudalism is not economical system, it's a legal system that peasants are obligated to work for the master and the master is protecting them. So it's some sort of joint venture really. And although the terms are very strict, that sometimes the peasants cannot leave or cannot buy themselves out or something, depending on the country, depending on the region, but it's still a legal system. It's not to sum up, capitalism is something that exists always, like the air. You can have a mass capitalism, and big firms, big factories, yes, and you can have a small, modest capitalism, yes, but you always have some sort of capitalism. Just making a whole country crazy and thinking that you are inventing socialism, it does not mean that you have another economical system. You still have capitalism, but you're just behaving in this capitalistic system in a stupid way, creating a socialist tyranny. That's the only thing that's happened. But does not mean, of course, that some sort of protectionism is not needed. Sometimes it is needed sometimes, but but to sum up, I think that capitalism is a strange name for free market, just, and free market exists always. Capitalism is the name to make the free market less natural, to make us think that capitalism is something that is unnatural. And in fact, capitalism is natural as air or water, because it's just our urge to have more interesting stuff, and we all always want to live better. We want to have interesting stuff, and we want to exchange things, exchange gifts. It's very natural. So, and feudalism is just a legal system, and socialism is just a crazy way of doing very poor capitalist, very poor free market job, just making the country one big factory, to one into one big factory, which is too big to run in a proper manner and too big to control and so on. So it's bound to fail. In the 18th century, Britain already in the 18th century, even in the late 17th century, but especially in the early 18th century, Britain has already implemented this idea that they should have twice as many ship and as the second and third country naval power. So British Navy was always stronger than French Navy in the 18th century. Always, it was so always. Sometimes when you double the second, that is the French Navy, and combine it, sometimes it was done so with the Spanish ships, with the Spanish naval power, then you would have almost the level or even slightly bigger navy than the British one. But basically, the English were always investing much more in the navy than in the army. The army was mistrusted. Many politicians, especially from the Whig Party, were of an opinion that having a large standing army, land army, would means that you are on the slippery slope to tyranny, and that should be avoided by all costs. So you should be concentrating more on the navy, because navy is free spirited, navy is good, and it was mainly fought in this way. And of course Britain could afford this way of thinking, because they are living on an island. So they were always having a stronger fleet. And yes, there were times during the war of the Spanish succession at the beginning of the 18th century. In the 1760s, you had this moment when Spain is joining the war on French side, and again you have the combination of two fleets, combining the two navies combined, and the same we can see in during the Napoleonic period. So yeah. So, but Britain were always very much preoccupied to have this naval power, more or less double the size of two of the second and third navy in Europe, and it was always so. When it changed only in late late 19th century, when America and Germany also tried to have big navies, and it was after World War I established that the navies of the victorious powers should be in relation, in proportion to one another. It was called the Washington system. It was revolutionary because it was agreed that okay, the U.S. Navy can be as big as the British Navy, as the Royal Navy, but when it comes to Japanese Navy, it could be only on more or less 60% when it comes to tonnage, and when it comes to weight and armament, could only make up to 60% of the American or British Navy size. And when it comes to France and Italy, which also were victorious powers of the World War One, they were. It was agreed that their naval power should be as big as 40% of only. So it was put on paper in this form: U.S. And UK 5-5, then Japan 3, then France and Italy 2-2. This was the system. So 100%, 100%, 60%, 60%, 40%, 40%, if you prefer this way. So and it was totally new system, but up to late 19th century, it was usually the case that the British naval power was as big as, for instance, as big as two next naval powers of Europe, and also they were also trying to compete with American Navy, which was growing fast, and Russian Navy, which was easier because the Russian Navy was sunk at Tsushima Strait and in 1905. So this tendency is constant. Shogo Makishima, the elements of your idea, the elements of your speech are too separated from each other. I don't even know what you are referring to. I didn't see the Team America. Is this some sort of documentary film, or this some sort of Yes, Russian Empire, especially in, yes, exactly, especially in 1914, was slowly developing capitalistic or free market economy. Yes. Yes, I was. I don't know if someone of you has read the memoirs of Nicholas II, the last Tsar of Russia. I have, I have, and sometimes I wished I hadn't, but no, of course, I'm joking here. It's always preferable, in my opinion, in my humble opinion as historian and a political scientist, I would like to be also, and I'm trying to be. Um, I think it's always preferable to read some good memoirs, or read even just memoirs of the leading politicians of the time, than studying some sort of over philosophied treatises of about global politics or something like this, because you have much more insight. You get much more insight when you just read the memoirs, even if they are badly written, as the Nicholas II wrote. Mm, wrote them, and those were very uninteresting. But interesting is how uninteresting they are. It's extremely interesting. For instance, um, he's mainly preoccupied with visiting new chapels, with visiting new cerkvia, with visiting new churches, and praying here for the sake of something, for the health of the royal family, and imperial family, or something like this, which is, I think, well, it's nice, but we can see that it was totally this person was totally devoid of any rationality. He was totally separated from the real politics, from the real um, political thinking, and we can see that he was just awful as a leader, especially considering how hard were the times Russia was going through. Uh, well, liberal imperialism, that can mean many things. It can be, for instance, establishing democracy in Iraq, for instance, which was a very interesting and good idea. It was less ideal to try to put this in Afghanistan, for instance, because Afghanistan is not as centralized country, which has some um, bricks to make this construction from, and it's totally devoid of any substantial support for such a system. But because Afghanistan is to a large extent, it's just a combination of separate tribes, and it's not. It's like a pre-modern state, so you cannot really assume that you could transform it into the modern democracy. But when it comes to Iraq, you can do it. So it's not always the same situation in all the regions, and it shouldn't be seen as some way of thinking for all occasions and for all regions. And it's not so anymore, and this is the good thing. But we cannot. Oscar Snyder is right when he assumes that maybe the whole idea is dead, and it's not a good thing. But maybe the task that is China, the challenge that is China for the Western states, and you know how China is, yeah, how tyrannical, how controlling, how forging information, how much it's a stealing hooligan and so on, and bully in the region and so on. That this challenge can be so big that the Western European states cannot really afford making democracies, installing democracies in Iraq's and Afghanistan's of the world, no matter if this is a good idea. As I said, as I mentioned, in Iraq it was a good idea because it was a modern state already to some extent. In Afghanistan it was a bad idea, but still, bad or not, maybe we as the West, we cannot really afford to make such obligations, to meet such obligations, and we must concentrate on China, and on China only, in order to succeed. And so maybe it's not the case that the West has refused to make this kind of politics, to continue this type of politics. Maybe just The way the world is now, that you can either counter China's China's imperialism, or in this way, that you have to resign all the other um, from all the other projects in all other countries. So maybe not the idea is that, but the opportunity is already closed. That this era when the Western countries could make something for the democracy in Iraq, and at the same time fighting the Chinese, it's over. Maybe that's the case. So the idea is not dead, but we cannot afford to act according to this idea anymore. Well, I have no proof, no substantial proof to um, to back this idea that the level of intelligence is going down in the Western world or in any other part of the world. I think it's just the opposite. But maybe our requirements, or how highly we would like people to operate intellectually, is that our expectations are growing. It's also possible. It's not so easy, of course, to answer such complicated questions. And I mentioned earlier that, for instance, it could be a problem that people are not reading so many reading so many books as they used to before. But maybe it's not a problem at all, because we have different means of communication and different ways of distributing knowledge. I don't understand uh, what you say about the fertility growth. Oh yes, yes, I understand what you say now. Yes, the fertility growth could be much more under what the present situation looks like, if hadn't this plan of Pinset Plus been implemented. Yes, so we can assume that the fertility rate would drop even more without those programs implemented. Yes, so we'll never know. Yeah. So, for instance, the opposition party, the Civic Platform, Platforma Obywatelska, is always assuming, for political reason, for political purposes, that it's those programs are not working because the fertility rate is not growing. Yes, but maybe the fertility rate would be plummeting if not for those programs. We don't know. So, yeah. That's the thing. That's why all this knowledge, known as all this knowledge that is considering the social and political problems, are not strictly scientific. They are called humanities for the good reason, because we don't have the laboratory in which, in one case, we would have a society with Pincet Plus program, and in the other we would have not the exactly same society without, though, this additional element. That would be a good laboratory venue for a laboratory, but we cannot do such kind of laboratory for humans, because we are humans and we are living within the society. So those are humanities just, and this so we sometimes guess and not know for certain. When it comes to economy and religion, I was not discussing it very broadly. When it comes to Benjamin Constant and Tocqueville. I was concentrating, making those films. I was concentrating more on political systems. Yes, Tomasz Wróblewski. Yes, Wolność w remoncie. Wolność w remoncie. Yes, he is very much he's very much looking for information which would corroborate his stories. So he is doing the exact opposite. Tomasz Wróblewski, Wolność w remoncie. He's making the exact opposite of good scientific work. That's the problem with him. He's very much full of BS. Tomasz Wróblewski, Wolność w remoncie. And he never quotes, he never reads, I think, any book that was published before 1800s. So, and he still want to pontificate about the global processes that take place through centuries. So that could be problematic with this approach. Yeah. I have the impression that the media try to talk to us that the feeling of hatred is something not appropriate. I think the evolution deliberately caused that we hate. Is this media message harmful? Yes, it could be harmful. Yes, being too nice can be harmful in such some situations, and we are aspiring to be totally idealistic, and it's not a good thing, because I think to some extent everyone is a little bit racist to some extent, because we are evolutionally, when based on revolution, we are prepared in such a way that we would trust rather people who look a little bit or behave like us more, and we would be abstaining from people who are less like us, and this is evolutionary precaution. And this is not me that not that this does not mean that in modern societies this cannot be problematic, because it is, and it can be, but also fighting this tendency, this program we have installed in our brains, it's also, I think, futile and can be harmful. Yes. Well, we people don't use battleships anymore. They use cruisers, and cruisers are the last big gun, big tonnage ships that floats over the water, and they can be useful because the Russians and the Americans still have cruisers, but battleships are not so. Battleships which are basically doubly armored cruisers are not needed anymore, because um, they they were a sensible invention when the main battle was done by by guns, and now the rockets can blow everything up, no matter how much steel you would put on it. So it's more useful to have aircraft carriers with a very dense anti-aircraft defense mechanisms and systems, which is far more useful than having battleships which with double armor. Because, for instance, we can also cite some battles between, or skirmishes between um, cruisers and battleships, and we know what happened to HMS Hood when it encountered the German Bismarck. And Bismarck was a battleship, and Hood was just a big cruiser. So the battle, the skirmish, the encounter lasted like 8 minutes, and the Hood was under the water after that. So yeah, So battleships were very sensible back then because the aircraft was still ineffective, and now battleships are a little bit like wasting of steel. Well, yes, Nicholas II, the last Tsar, was very much under the influence of his wife, but he was also very ineffective due to his very profound and very unmodern, very medieval type of religiosity. He was very much. His mind was occupied with religious matters all the time. When you read his memoirs, and I strongly recommend it to you to read the memoirs of Nicholas II, because for me it was something like a revelation, because it was I was expecting something totally different, and reading memoirs is always helping to understand the memoirs of every interesting person, and the uninteresting person with big power, as Nicholas II was. You can see what his mind was preoccupied about, and then you can see that this mind was occupied all the time with religious ceremonies and family occasions, family ceremonies. So he was not an effective leader because he was simply not thinking about matters of state. Even when you take the memoirs of Catherine the Great, for instance, she was probably Catherine the Great and not Kathleen the Small, because she was also thinking not only about the futile things and fashionable dresses or something like this, and some court ornaments and so on, but she was also to some extent interested in the matters of international politics. For instance, when you take the memoirs of Catherine the Great from 18th century, then you will see that she was not aware even of the existence of Russia outside of court, but still she was aware very much about of the international politics. And in the memoirs of Nicholas II, you don't have even that, and that's why you don't have even that. So he was dead. Yeah, dead by stupidity. Independent trader 21. I don't understand. Is this some sort of what? Of website? Stanisław Bartosiewicz, you said that some IQ tests are correlated and some are not. I assume that they use different methods. Yes, yes, exactly. Let's just ignore those not highly correlated. Yes, we could do so, but when you come across any article on I don't know, some website or in the paper, then you never know what kind of IQ test they are referring to. So that's the problem. Not the problem is not the you can of course, knowing the methods that were implemented, you know which IQ test is more promising and which is probably totally unscientific. But that is not a problem when you have the information from first hand information. But when you have second-hand information, like mentioning in the paper or on the website of some IQ test, you never know what was the standard of that particular test. So, and whether correlated or not. So we are back to the same problem, even if we use the sensible thing that you are proposing. Well, beautiful palaces were built in the days of feudalism, that's true. But when you consider places that were built for the better usage by the people or by army, like barracks, like place, like houses for the masses to live in, then the picture is not that. not that enchanting. Yes, so maybe we are just the way we are just built in this way that we either make a very exceptionally beautiful palaces for the elites, or we are more practical, and that means also that for instance, the parliament building of Budapest, for instance, is maybe not as spectacular as Versailles. Certainly, it's not as spectacular as Chateau de Versailles, but in the same time, you have the needs of the masses more answered, and it's very complicated to draw those comparisons when it comes to architecture and good politics and good policy in relation to the past epochs. No, it's not cosplay. It's more, to some extent, it's theater, and it's some to some extent is historical reconstruction. I do not always possess the costumes and the equipment to make the real impersonation, or they make the real reenactment, or make the real reconstruction of the past. But I like, even in spite of it, I like to create an impression that it has to do something. It has that what I'm making, what I'm wearing, had some relation to the past, and to the previous eras, and so this is the theater element. But cosplay is not the word that I am very fond of, because cosplay is more about it's more about playing the role of some people from different dimensions or different eras, or something like this, without so much regard to the facts or to the general general mm, mood of the era, or something like this. Would I like to return to 18th century fashion with men in wigs, leggings, and so on? Well, I am not sure. It's hard to say. Sometimes I would like, but to return. But I like many epochs, so I'm not totally dogmatic about 18th century, or I'm not a fanatic of 18th century. I just like this era because it's an important one. But I even more I also wanted to have those costumes not only to participate in galas, events, and so on, but also to make something that can be shown, not only being a king of paper, of articles, and paper here, paper there, but also to make impression, to make some living history, and to combine the two, and that's why I have so many costumes from different eras. Of course, 18th century is my main field of interest, but not the only one. And I have devoted the biggest number of my books to 18th century, but it's not everything to me. It's just the most important era for me, because 18th century it combines those medieval moods of Inquisition and so on, but also these modernity elements of modernity very present in this era, which we cannot find so much in the 17th century. And because 17th century was a pessimistic era, that it was believed in those times that all human tragedies are unavoidable, and 18th century was far more optimistic. It was far more idealistic, so to say, and it's much more creative, even though the microscope, the telescope, was already invented in the 17th century and only perfected in 18th century. But for instance, inoculation against smallpox was invented by Edward Jenner, implemented by Edward Jenner in the 18th century. We can see the triumph over nature to some extent for the first time in 18th century. We can only also see the optimistic way of thinking and the liberal way of thinking for the first time on the massive scale. So it will always be the epoch number one for me, but mostly for the reasons of the spirit and not for the reasons of the clothing and architecture, and although those are very pleasant for me also. Well, talking about IQ today is not fashionable when it comes to controversial issues as race and culture and so on, immigration and so on. But it's very popular when it comes to make an individual taking individual tests. Like it's almost like asking, have you already taken your breakfast? Have you already taken your IQ tests? It's almost as natural. So this is on this individual level. This is a very very fashionable topic of discussion indeed. So I cannot be wholly agreed with what you said or written, what you wrote. Well, the media is considered media is concentrated on global massive events. So of course, but also you can see that on this individual level, IQ tests are very popular when it comes to YouTube channels and so on. So it's not so unpopular after all. Much more unpopular is, I think, the ideas of Freud, the psychoanalysis, which are the tendency is growing for making for just stating that all it's unscientific, which and this claim is totally wrong. Some of the elements in Freud's teachings were scientific, some were not. Just like the some of the tests, IQ tests, are scientifically valuable, some are not. Already one of you have asked me this question about Evergrande, whether it will fail and cause crisis, and I said, and I will say that again, that it's we are dealing mostly with forged information, with false information when it comes to Chinese economy. The Chinese are forging their economical information and their balances and so on. So we don't really know what is happening in there, and you can even see it very plainly when you switch on the Fox Business channel or even the programs which from this newsware from this network that are presented on YouTube. You will see that they are just guessing. They don't have the data, so we don't know. And I will not pretend that I know something that the economists don't know, because they cannot know the information which are hidden. The data, the economical data that are related to China are usually the data that the Chinese regime, the Chinese government want people to see, not the data that actually have some relation with any reality. Yeah, but also Poland lacks equipment to build an atomic weapon. I only hope for Australia that the AUKUS will be the slippery slope to build an atomic weapon, because the atomic weapons in the hands of the Australians are safe, and sensible to have and to deter to be a deterrent against Chinese and their appetites. Because I understand that every empire has this tendency of growing and taking new spheres of influence, but in case of Chinese government, this influence is just is growing proportionally to the limiting of free speech worldwide and so on. And for instance, even this wrestler John Cena was making this um, self self humiliation, self humiliating words about to the Chinese audience, to the Chinese public, because he has said something critical about Chinese government. He was apologizing in perfect Mandarin for it, so it was a little bit strange to see this strong man, literary strong man, full of muscles and so on, who was apologizing to the Chinese like a little baby. It was pathetic. So yeah. Okay, so I don't know what would be a consequence of announcing such an intention. I think that without equipment to make an atomic weapon, we shouldn't be announcing any intention of it because it's stupid. Um, so North Korea didn't build any atomic weapons. They just were given those weapons were just given to them in secret by the Chinese. Of course, you don't. It's funny that you believe that North Korea had the real equipment to build such a weapon. Okay, so I think we are done. I have planned to do this Q&A 2 hours long, and we have made it. We are just past the moment of 6 minutes after 2 hours, so I think it's enough for tonight. And I will put this Q&A video or the link to it on the community site because it will, considering the size of this clip, it will be rendering for many hours. So in order to secure the access for the people who were not able to see it and to participate in this Q&A with us, they will be able to have a quicker access to this as the normal recorded film, not live, just normal regular film. So yeah. So thank you for your attention and thank you for your questions. Some were really very interesting and they always make me think. Especially this time, it was especially the case when somebody have some of you. I sorry, I don't recall which person has connected this refusal of the Chinese to sign an alliance with Russia in 2019 with AUKUS project. It's very interesting that AUKUS maybe, and I have already built upon it the idea that maybe AUKUS is possible only because Russia and China are not standing together because the Chinese were stupid and they refused the Russians the alliance with Russia. So I'm glad that the Chinese are making mistakes, not because I dislike the Chinese. I think the Chinese are, on average, very wonderful people, hardworking and interesting, and so on, and simply nice and so on. But the government, well, is something completely different, especially when we don't have any sympathetic and we don't have any nice and smiling Hu Jintaos, but gloomy and threatening Xi Jinping's on this, and we don't have normal mandates and mandate periods when we have some eternal presidents, eternal pseudo presidents already. So it's looking very uneasy for me. I think So okay, so thank you for your attention, and I will put this the link to this Q&A on the community. So if you want to recall any element, a particular element of it, thank you.